welcome to Varn Vlog, and today I'm with Dave Eden, and we're going to start off by discussing the conditions and political economy of Australia. But before that, we're gonna start off with something in the national civic space of the Australian consciousness, and then we're going to talk about that. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Dave.
Thanks, Varn. Hi, everyone. My name's Dave Eden. I'd like to start today by giving an acknowledgement of country. I am speaking from Brisbane, or Meanjin, which is the lands of the Yagara and Turrbal peoples, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge that sovereignty has never been seceded.
Okay, and I am going to do something that I normally make fun of. I am speaking from Ute country, on Ute ancestral and territorial lands, and Paiute ancestral territorial lands. We don't add anything additional to our land acknowledgements because in some cases, some of the peoples aren't even around anymore. Although the Utes and the Paiutes are both still extant tribes. And I was going to ask you, we were talking about this a little bit off air, that the land acknowledgement or acknowledgement of country in your case, and they're very similar in their format, just listening to it, is in the United States, it started in activist spaces. It has seemingly gotten stuck in academic spaces. Like you will see, and like if you go to your average state or non-conservatively private school, you'll see like some acknowledgement even often on the bottom of an email. But it has not carried over to civic culture outside of very educated, very elite spaces at all. And indigenous peoples here actually tend to be themselves very split on the acknowledgements because they're like, well, you know, it's I guess it's nice, but what does that do about anything? But it hasn't, interestingly, become like the touch point for reactionaries here because, frankly, they just don't get that much exposed to it unless they're on academic campuses. So,
okay, cool. So, yeah, so
what's going on in Australia?
So it is definitely part of the Australian public culture at the moment. So obviously Australia, it is the term that most kind of radicals would use is they describe it as a settler colony. I think there's a really important argument about the interrelationship of capitalism and colonialism that has very different political implications, and amongst friends and comrades, sometimes you really kind of dig into that. But a key part of that has been, obviously, since colonisation, there has been resistance by Indigenous peoples in Australia. And I would say over the last 20 years, when Australian society has been largely very stable, it has been like Indigenous people who continue to be left out of what we might call the social deal in Australia, and also have been struggling across multiple fronts about that. And in very complicated ways, that has had a profound kind of transformation in public culture and forms of expression, if not really transforming the miserable conditions of oppression for a lot of Indigenous people. And so one marker of that is that the acknowledgement of country, which is different from a welcome to country. So a welcome to country would be performed by Indigenous people in their country to welcome other people to that country. And there's a separate politics around that too. An acknowledgement of country has been fairly generalized. So every meeting that I have at work, and I work at a university, would start with an acknowledgement of country. When a plane lands, so if you catch a plane from Sydney to Canberra, when the plane lands, an acknowledgement of country will be played when the plane lands. There's two football semi-finals on tonight, rugby league and Australian rules, AFL, and both of those will start with an acknowledgement of country. That's hegemonic, right? There is a section of reactionaries that have seen that as a touchstone to push against. So the one of the core, like the Australian right is, you know, a real toilet of grifters. So they're always fighting for like different space, but probably the dominant non-Nazi faction is a party called One Nation. And they have opposed this for a considerable amount of time. The larger conservative bloc the Liberal National Coalition, they'll try to be more sophisticated. So the previous Liberal Prime Minister tried to add on, go, what we're going to do is we're going to do an acknowledgement of country, and then we're going to thank the troops, like added on to that as well. But recently, there's a reactionary football commentator who's calling for people to boo the acknowledgement of country. And also, it's like football has been very important in the public debate about racism in Australia as well. Like Indigenous people do have proportionately incredibly well in in Australian rules in particular, and public debates around racism as it's expressed on the football field, and that's also become more complicated as we've had different waves of non-white migration, and they've been reflected in sport has been one of the ways that racism has been debated in Australia. And a number of Indigenous people have gone from making their name as football players to becoming social and political actors. So this is being debated out in really kind of complicated ways, and it's happening in the context of a referendum that's going on in Australia over an Indigenous voice to Parliament being enshrined in the Constitution. Now, at the same time, there are radical Indigenous voices that do critique the acknowledgement as being purely performative as well. If you look at any of the statistics, and they're captured, they're regularly by the Closing the Gap reports, like life expectancy for Indigenous people, health indicators for Indigenous people, the rates of incarceration for Indigenous people, horrific, right? I think like it's not hyperbole to say that when you dig into like juvenile imprisonment, you're often looking at over 90% of the people that are being incarcerated are Indigenous people, right? And I think Indigenous people are 3 to 4% of the population overall. I'd have to go back and check those stats. So structurally, race in Australia is still totally fucked, right? And that's also built into a mode of accumulation, a form of capitalism in Australia that's still largely reliant on digging shit out of the ground, particularly in areas where there are still large Indigenous populations making land right claims. This is very, very fused, and it's a very intense debate. But the acknowledgement of the country has been a kind of social victory at some level, even if that critique happens. Does that make sense, Varn?
No, absolutely. I'm actually just trying to. What I'm parsing out when I'm listening to this is, on one hand, I'm sure that this is a trans-Indigenous movement in various places across the world, particularly the settler colonial world. At the same, and I'll define what I mean by that. We often focus on the United States. My stance is every established state in the Americas, with the exception of maybe Bolivia, and Uruguay, is effectively a settler colonial government, and everyone's at different parts and different ways to how they deal with it. In U.S. life, Indigenous people make up, depending on whether or not you include it in Native Hawaiians, between less than 1% or 2% of the population. And unfortunately, they are strongly overshadowed by other racial dynamics in the country, both in terms of the Latin population, both in immigration and through the fact that a good portion of our country used to be Mexico itself, a settler colonial.
Yeah. Okay. So this is like, let's make a jump, right? And okay, so if you want to talk about Australia and Australian society and capitalism in Australia, and I'm cribbing a lot of the work of an Australian writer called Angela Metropolis, who people should go out and really check, right? But the foundation of capitalism in Australia has always relied on a particular politics of race that has had kind of two layers to it. First of all has been the exclusion and oppression of Indigenous people, and that starts. And then the second has been the regulation of the migrant population. And, the White Australia policy exists, was it up to the early 70s? We formally have a White Australia policy. And it's been crucial because what we call Australian social democracy, Labourism, was a long-term supporter of these racial politics.
Mm-hmm.
In particular, the strategy was the way that you maintain wages is that you limit migration, and you for a long period of time you fix that as white migration. So there were these two lines, the exclusion oppression of indigenous people, an attempted genocide, let's be serious about it,
Mm-hmm.
and at the same time a kind of regulation of who gets in to a labor force that's protected by migration. And there's a key Australian text called New Britannia by an Australian communist author, Humphrey McQueen, which is, if people are going to read a book on Australia, I'd really recommend New Britannia. And Humphrey McQueen is like a fascinating guy. He's a really great dude as well, and we can talk about him more as well. And New Britannia really spells out how important this commitment to white Australia and to British Empire was to the development of labourism in Australia. And that's been very important because there was previously a kind of popular myth that would like to cast Australia as a nation of convicts and therefore of larrikins and rebels, right? Kind of oppressed by the evil British. But really, when you get into it, it's something else. And even today, you will see that the dominant strategy of labourism, so that's the Labor Party and the trade unions, is a mixture of arbitration. So rather than kind of class fight, you get together with the state, the boss, and the union, and you try to set wage conditions within a level that still allows accumulation and a limit of who can enter the labour force. But at the same time, there's another tension because obviously capital, on the other hand, wants a growing migrant and wants a growing labour force, right? And often what Australia has benefited from since the end of the Second World War is that we get adult migrants. So someone else does the training of them. They come here and they grow our labour force. And then the people who've come here have then engaged in a series of struggles against racism here. So multiculturalism in Australia is both a history of state policy, but also a multiculturalism from below at the same time. And you get very complicated regulatory forms around a form of guest labor as well, where people can come here with different visas at different times. They don't have citizen rights. They're locked in working in agricultural sections and things like that. So that complicated dynamic of race, of a social deal offered to people on race, but capital's desire for an expanding labor force mixed with the struggle against racism of people here is the history of Australia. Within a particular, and that only makes sense because of Australia's particular role in the world system of capitalism.
Yeah, which is
to leap ahead.
Yeah, well, to me, Australia is unlike the United States. It's a core periphery at the same time. Like we have, like the United States as a whole is a core country. Although we have internal peripheries, which I think is often missed in the analysis of the United States, very strong ones. And I'm sure, in fact, I know Australia does too. But Australia is, I don't know anyone who would exclude Australia from the core, but you're not. Totally. You're not a power country in the core. So it's a very, like, even when we talk about like modern monetary theory dynamics, we always throw out Australia as one of the examples because for some reason they don't seem to notice, with the exception of Japan, everybody they mention is part of the former British imperial system.
Yeah.
But
so a very interesting Australian political economist, Bruce McFarlane, died recently, and he's a really interesting dude. Like he was a Maoist, but also kind of kicked around with the post-Keynesians. Got in biffs with the cops. Really interesting guy. I stumbled across an essay of his a couple of years ago in a book from the 70s called Australian Capitalism Towards a Socialist Critique. And he lays out in very broad brushstrokes the kind of unique conditions of Australia. And one is that because since its colonization, it has been a safe space for capital, right? It's been a safe space for the British Empire, then for American imperial power. There has always been capital that has flowed into Australia. And also, as a resource exporting country, it's actually been exporting resources that have had quite high returns. And, we've always had, except for a few exceptions, like a positive terms of trade. And his kind of argument is that because there's capital flowing in, and because these like particularly the mining boom in this century, things like the mining boom or the previous wool exports, there's always been this buffer to Australian capitalism that's meant class struggle has never been particularly intense. There's been enough capital coming in that the bosses haven't had to force extra profits out of the wages here, out of workers here, to push accumulation further. And the racial politics that I just talked about there sit within that place in the world system. If Australia is a corporate, now it's not really my language, right? Like however you want to like describe, I'm still one of the, of the 5 remaining Negrians in Australia in some ways, right?
Maybe
like
one of the 5 remaining Negrians on the planet. But yes, go ahead.
Totally, right? Well, I don't know about that, but there's certainly my very close comrades. We all kind of started reading Negri together in Wollongong 20 years ago, and like we've got a particular reading and critique, right? But certainly, however you typify the world order, the Australian state, the ruling class and the political class has always been a loyal participant, an active participant in the maintenance of the world order. Some debate about where it should be, where we should orientate towards. Like, against British loyal, like right now, there would probably be a debate between those who think we should ally to the US and be drawn into a horrific war with China, and those that think that's insane, particularly because capital accumulation in Australia right now is entirely tied to Chinese stimulus, right? Like the reason that we've only had a small recession, and that was during the COVID period over the last 30 years. So the 2008 crisis didn't really impact Australia as much as it did anywhere else. Like formally, I think apart from just a period in COVID, maybe 2020, maybe 2021, there's been no recession in Australia for about 3 decades. And that is largely because we're tied into accumulation in China and the stimulus in China. We dig shit out of the ground that goes over there. But Australia has always been a kind of loyal participant in the maintenance of that world system. And with prominent attempts to struggle against that as well. You've got to remember too that there's plenty of US troops here as well.
Oh yeah,
and increasingly, like we're spending a vast amount of money buying some subs, nuclear subs, and stationing cruise missiles and all this kind of shit that's going on at the moment. And the peace movement is beginning to kind of ramp up again, particularly as opposing the AUKUS treaty and Australia's increasing movement. Sorry, I'm jumping all over the place here, but yes. Race related to a particular form of accumulation, which fits within a particular role in the world system here, which produces a particular kind of politics that I think is very different from just the models in the UK or the US or Europe when we want to talk about class and struggle, social democracy, unions, and the left in Australia.
Well, and this is something that I've been trying to wrap my head around for a long time because in many ways the US and Australia they superficially seem similar as post British colonial holdings who have relative independence for different reasons and through different legal mechanisms. But also in relation to indigenous peoples and the British pattern of handling settler colonialism, which tend to be more eliminationist than say New Spain or whatever.
Yeah.
Yet it has seemed to me that like okay, there's been mechanisms in both places that suppressed class intensity to some degree, but they're very different in how they operate.
They're very different. If you do yourself, I reckon I'm sure you've got lots of books to read. You should do yourself a favor and read this novel called Power Without Glory by Frank Hardy. Sorry. So it's a novel about the Labour Party written by a communist author that was banned for a period of time, right? And the story behind it is great, but like that's a really great book to give you an understanding about how the class dynamic in Australia was managed. So given those conditions that I've previously described, the model, I guess the deal that was offered to Australia was a deal to the class in Australia. It was a deal that was built around white Australia on one side and arbitration on the other side.
Mm-hmm.
So this was an idea rather than kind of like open class fights, that capital and the state and unions would get together, and the Harvester decision is the classic one. It's 1912 or something like that, where they say, okay, what is a family wage? And we set that wage, right? And we go, okay, if you work this job in this industry, this is what you get paid. And
Right.
that provided an overall framework. Now, class struggles still happened. Movement still went on. There were still brutal battles, but it happened within that framework that was able to kind of contain conditions overall up until, I guess, the crisis of the 70s, when a new model was developed. And that new model that was developed, say we call it neoliberalism, in Australia was also implemented through Labor Party and the trade union. So there's a book that all your listeners should run out and get by Liz Humphreys called How Labor Built Neoliberalism. And so basically, when the Labor government comes to power, late 70s, early 80s, they do a thing called the Accord, where the trade unions, businesses, and the Labor government sit down together and implement what we understand neoliberalism to be, right? It's not Thatcher fighting the miners. It's not, I think there was a pilots battle under Reagan, right, in the US. It's incorporation. So if you're going to paint that broad brushstroke, what is unique about Australia is that level of capitalism here having the ability to allow a national level management of the class dynamic, broken down in periods during the crisis or elements of struggle. Obviously the waves of struggles in the 60s and 70s, but overall that has been the framework. Those of us that want to go beyond it have been compelled to go to challenge the racial basis and the arbitration basis, if that makes sense.
No, it makes sense. I mean, what makes Australia then interesting, actually, is that your path to neoliberalism is actually more similar to, say, Norway or Sweden's path, but with the caveat that there's this settler colonial racial dynamics, which also in some ways superficially looks like the US or a lot of the other post-British holdings, Canada to some degree.
So there's two things immediately, Varn, that's super interesting about that. So the Communist Party supported the Accord process. And one of the reasons they supported the Accord process was they thought they were getting like a Swedish plan out of it. That neoliberalism would provide an increased social wage. And certainly the Labourism of the Hawke and Keating government in the 70s was a progressive understanding of neoliberalism, that relaunched capital accumulation would be the thing that would solve the racial dynamics and gender oppression in Australia. Paul Keating, who was the driver of this, he was the treasurer under Hawke, then the prime minister. If you ever watch his Redfern address, where he goes and talks to a group of indigenous people, the level of critique he makes about settler colonialism in the early 90s, a politician couldn't make that now. It was that radical, right? He's like, we took your land, we took your children, we murdered you. We've got to fix this. And his version of land rights was certainly critiqued. I was in the IS at the time when he was doing this, was certainly critiqued, but it was a progressive version of neoliberalism, if that makes sense. The other thing that is interesting, if we talk about reactionaries in Australia, because broadly the period of the end of the social democratic labourist compromise fits in broadly with the end of white Australia and Australia becoming functionally an incredibly multicultural place. It means that this often get in reactionary discourse, the critique of neoliberalism becomes a racist one, if that makes sense. We used to have an honest social democratic deal, and then we allowed Asian migration and it all ended. So that there is that kind of association out there of a kind of a reactionary critique of neoliberalism that it calls for a reinstantiation of white Australia.
So, and this is an interesting thing to think about when you talk about this from the kind of understanding our two countries through contrast. We are just getting the kind of reactionary that you have had for a long time.
Yeah.
Like the reactionary critique of neoliberalism is coming to the U.S. very late.
But what we're getting from you is the anti-trans politics.
Yes, and weird.
So thank you.
And weird medicalization theories. Yeah,
it's wild, right? It's real. Like that's like the, and I think also as well, it's like the political class in Australia are fucked, right? They're just incompetent, and so the kind of the political class that of the 80s and 90s were very competent people that came out of trade unions, came out of the Liberal Party machine as well. But the current layer of politicians are just awful. And so the reactionaries certainly are looking to American culture wars and kind of strategically experimenting with them here as well. So there is certainly, the reactionaries here are trying to, like after the victory of the same-sex marriage plebiscite a couple of years ago, and that things, obviously there's still bigotry against queer people in Australia, but what was largely seen as a social victory, a lot of the reactionaries are starting to pick that up. And one of the few terms that I think I don't know if listeners aren't probably familiar with my podcast or my blog, but I invented a term a couple of years ago called the cosmic right, which is probably my one contribution to intellectual, and like the cosmic right in Australia. So like hippie fascists, they've really picked up the anti-trans stuff here as well. So we've got that's what we've taken from the US.
Well, it's one of America's greatest exports on both the left and the right, actually, is weird interpretations of cultural war battles, which is often,
for sure.
For example, there has been an Americanization of the European left way of speaking about a lot of these issues, which has actually kind of baffled me because we're more decoupled in a lot of ways than we've ever been, at least until the Russia-Ukraine war, and when I deal with, when I talk to Australians, it seems like there's been some of that with the left, just because.
So totally. So on a multiple different levels, like historically, like we got post-structuralism through American literature departments.
So you got our interpretation of France.
We got so it means like, it was only in the last 10 or 15 years that it kind of realized that, actually, Althusser and Foucault were all sitting down talking together. Because in the 80s here, you were either an Althusserian or you were into Foucault, and there was just like a cut between them, right? And so, and some people went over. So like, the big English Althusserian Hindus ended his life in Australia, who obviously became a Foucaultian. Great guy as well, like lovely dude. Became a Foucaultian before the end of his life. But we got that kind of theory not directly from the French, but and that created a lot of kind of confusion over a long period of time. When I was young, we got a lot of kind of European traditions, I guess, via the US as well. Like I have a vast amount of autonomedia and semiotext books on my shelf. For example, Crime Think was pretty big in the scene that, I was part of. And then I guess also in terms of anti-racist stuff, the Black Lives Matters movement has been important here and taken up and rearticulated in different ways. But not all of those kind of critiques have come through either. The way that after the wave of revolts that people around like Shimon and people like that have made kind of critiques, those critiques necessarily haven't come here. So you have these weird moments where I went to this incredibly great rally, right, where it was a Black Lives Matter rally in Australia. This one was taken up really driven by like young Sudanese migrants, right, who like in the racial hierarchy in Australia get it, like they used to, can I just have a moment here because I think this is kind of crucial, right? Like so when there was a period of time where you could migrate to Australia after the period of the Second World War, get a very shit job at the bottom of the labor hierarchy, but still earn enough to accumulate property, right? So my grandparents on my mother's side were refugees after the Holocaust, right? But, worked as a butcher. My mum becomes a teacher. they've been able to have houses and a middle-class life. That probably extends up into the 70s and the 80s with maybe Vietnamese migration. So there's a large wave of Vietnamese migration after the end of the... And so I live in a Vietnamese suburb, and those people that came over in the late 70s, early 80s have been able to do the same. But if you kind of migrate now, the house prices are so large and the wages are so low, that kind of step of integration doesn't really exist anymore, right? So it's like pretty much if your family didn't make it here during Fordism, or you didn't come with money, so you're not a migrant, you're not a professional migrant, the idea of you could do labor at the bottom of the labor hierarchy and move yourself up, that road has closed. So that combined with the kind of racial dynamics in Australia, there is a particular kind of like condition against kind of the newer migrants from Africa face a lot of racism, right? So these, and it's often, police violence and these kind of things. There's lots of like, African youth crime gangs, panics in the media and that kind of stuff. So these youth had kind of taken up Black Lives Matter to kind of express this and had this rally. But it was really fascinating. It's great, good on them. But there was also obvious kind of disconnects here. So they take some of that language, that kind of like hands up, don't shoot kind of language from the US. But in Australia, the cops very rarely kill you by shooting you. They beat you to death. Like it's like the cops here do shoot people, but the cop murders of largely indigenous people in watch houses, whatever, they've run people over. They beat people to death, and then they beat them and they don't give them medical attention, and then they die, right? And it's also these kids were kind of like talking about the US slavery experience, where you would kind of think that what they weren't parallel meeting is that they were from countries that were kind of colonized by the English, who've come to a country that's colonized by the English. There's another point of connection. And there was lots of good dynamics going on between that I could observe as an old man, between young Sudanese kids and indige activists as well. But we get that stuff from America, but it takes a moment to digest it, if that makes sense. Or one of the things we get, and tell me when I'm just ranting here, like gentrification is an entirely inappropriate term to apply to Australia. But a lot of people look to the US, take the concept gentrification and apply that, and it just doesn't make sense. So anyway, I've been ranting. Yeah.
Well, I actually find it's interesting because, for example, in indigenous communities, we can't talk about gentrification. It's not applicable to our indigenous communities either. It's really applicable to like traditional Black neighborhoods that are actually themselves a product of deliberate developmental policy in the mid 20th century. But those patterns are very different. And I think one of the things that makes I've gone back and forth on why I think the U.S. racial dynamic is exported to so many places, other than our obvious media hegemony, which we clearly have in the English-speaking world. So I'm just going to accept that and take it as a given. But also, we have so many different kinds of racial hierarchies and oppressions here that there's generally something for you to glom onto. Like there are multiple and often opposed racial dynamics in the US that can speak to different dynamics in different places, but often not particularly well. Like I don't think, for example, to kind of like talk about this when you talk about African migrants have not had that much success picking up the language of Black Lives Matter here because their material conditions, while they are socially excluded and definitely receive anti-Black racism, their material conditions are actually so dramatically different in a lot of ways than, say, the descendants of slaves, that it is actually a tension in the discourse about whether or not it is appropriate for them to pick up the language.
That's interesting.
And I don't see, like, when I think about Australia, there's no history there that would lead to that kind of dynamic.
We have a very brutal, when it talks to migrant immigration, a very brutal discourse built around, can they be assimilated? If that makes sense. And you see it repeated since the 50s. Originally it's like, these Italians, can they be assimilated? These Greeks, can they be assimilated? Then it's like, these Croatians and Yugoslavians, then Vietnamese, then Asians, then Arabs, then Muslims, then black. It's the same discourse out there, like constantly deployed in terms of a form of policing, particularly on young men and youth and their behavior in public. Heavily, like the racist paranoias in Australia, heavily sexualized, heavily focused on racist violence, whipped up all the time. Crime, like I've seen multiple crime gang paranoias with different ethnic group in life, and that's just a mainstay of the reactionary basis in Australian politics. But at the same time, there's been long struggles against anti-racism, and like my kids go to the local public school. There's like 200. So public school in Australia is a state school. Right, so like we go to the local state school, the primary school there. There's about 220 kids there. There are 40 languages spoken at kids' homes. Right, so like that's, and I live in the electorate that elected in the early 90s Pauline Hanson, who is the most prominent reactionary politician.
Right,
if that makes sense. And
that makes total sense.
Yeah,
it's actually similar here. But weirdly, I think this is often missed by our own discourse, because it's not like the discourse we export doesn't reflect this. But if you look at like racial diversity is not actually a good predictor in the United States about even in a congressional district about where the politics is going to go, except for with one group, and that's the Black community. That's like the only one where it's the strongest predictor of whether or not someone is Democratic or not. And I think right now that's led to racial discourse dominating our kind of mainstream politics, but it's actually moving away from that, because Latin people and Asian immigrants are no longer voting Democratic in the same numbers that they used to.
Okay, so I want to add something. So something I observe, right, is that I think because of the existence of the Australian welfare state, right, and the state provision of support, there has not been the need to maintain ethnic identity-based fraternal societies to reproduce life like there has been in the US.
Absolutely.
Like, so it's not very common, like you see, like my sister lives in Santa Monica, and she's always like, she's always having her mind blown by people saying like, who are you? And they're like, oh, I'm Finnish, because their family came from Finland, like, 4 generations ago. There's an element of that. Like, so, if you like say there's lots of ethnic clubs, but they play they're often by the 3rd generation, they find themselves very hard to reproduce themselves. So like the Spanish club, which was in Sydney, had to close down because by the 3rd generation, kids aren't calling themselves Spanish anymore. Like the Polish club in my neighborhood is mainly kept together. Like it exists for like 1 wave or 2 of migration, but you haven't been historically dependent on these societies to reproduce life because the state provides welfare. Right, even though it's not as good as it used to be. So the maintenance of a kind of multiculturalism that's really based on going, oh, I'm not white, I'm this, isn't as strong in Australia as you see in the United States.
And that's also why you're more secular, to be frank.
Pardon?
It's also why you're more secular.
Australia, unbelievably. So like evangelical churches are seen as an American imposition. So like there's a common like expression in Australia where you say, oh, only in America, right? Like that's only in America. Or the liberal or center left will critique something as being American. So
I've
like
often heard that and laughed, actually, to be frank with you.
So like if there's an attempt to like say healthcare is the primary one, right? So like we have Medicare, so there's an element of state sponsored. No, it's good and it's bad. It doesn't cover everything. Let's not romanticize it. But every attempt
but it's better than what we have.
Oh, entirely. Well, so for example, like I would never think if my kids are sick in the middle of the night that it's going to cost me anything taking them to emergency, right? I never have to, like, it's so full on when you've got a sick child, right? The level of stress, particularly when they're under 5. And to think that I can't do this because of the cost. A lot of non-essential services cost a lot. If you have chronic illnesses, dental, all this stuff, either not covered, it's not perfect, but it certainly does something. But every time someone suggests, and like right-wing cranks are always like, oh, actually, we need to cut Medicare or whatever. Like it's critiqued as that is American. We don't want that because it's American. Evangelical preachers are critiqued as being American, even though Hillsong is an Australian product. It comes from 2 suburbs over from where I grew up. There are those kind of developments here, but yes, certainly things are evangelicalism is critiqued and far more secular.
Yeah,
it's been quite new for the reactionary forces to identify as being Christian, right? Like that's a relatively new thing to see that politicians on the right are like, oh yeah, I'm a practicing Christian. Like in the past, it was just I'm a cynical lawyer, and I probably go to church because I think it's good for social order. But I've got multiple girlfriends on the side. Would have been the old reactionary politician.
I mean, that's a fascinating change in our cultures in some way, because it's like your reactionaries are a lot more like us, and our reactionaries are, even though they would never state it this way, they're a lot more like European reactionaries these days.
Okay.
Like everybody's shifting and
yeah.
Because evangelicalism here if you're under the age of 35,
yeah,
it has almost no cultural import.
Okay, interesting.
But it has an extreme cultural import if you're over the age of 35. Like even if you, and so for example, like amongst debates here, you'll hear like Gloria Steinem come on and go on like The Guardian or the BBC or whatever, and she will talk about like the right. And when you talk in the Christian right in America, and when you talk to like 19-year-olds here, they're like, "What is she talking about?"
Yeah. Okay. Interesting.
And like, so there's this giant gap in the frameworks, but we've been exporting our religious reactionaries forever, and it is interesting. So I thought about how much American nonsense goes to Australia. But another funny thing that I've noticed is like reactionaries who don't succeed in Canada come to us.
Yeah,
so it's a very strange like pipeline between the English-speaking countries.
Yeah, and like there's a grifter economy in Australia too as well. You can be a bullshit reactionary grifter from North America and come here. But should we flip rather than just talking about the reactionaries to talk about the struggle? Are you interested?
You're like, where is the struggle and where is your left? Like,
yeah, it's very interesting. Like obviously I'm old, so I'm in my mid-40s and I don't hang out with a whole bunch of 18-year-olds, so I have a particular limited view. I think there is obviously struggles going on, lots and lots of struggles. The most prominent struggles for the last 20 years I feel, have been the struggles, have been indigenous struggles against racism and the settler colonial deal. This takes a number of different shapes. Some of it is cultural, so protesting things like the Invasion Day. So Australia Day is a holiday that celebrates colonialism, so contesting things like that, opposition to it, often under an Invasion Day idea. Cultural politics, there's a whole range of indigenous artists, and fights, very site-specific fights around land rights, and site-specific fights against police violence as well. That they have been the large struggles. Now, beyond that, right, again, what you have to keep in mind is that the material conditions of the majority of Australian population are quite complex.
mm-hmm.
That the neoliberal period here, and there's some really stuff I'm super fascinated by. So in what I would call the high neoliberal period, the share of income shifted in capital's favour, but more people in every Australian household started working. Working hours went up. Wages did continue to increase in a very unequal form till about 2013. There was a massive expansion in credit, and the prices of commodities dropped because we started importing some more stuff in China. So the shift of income in capital's favor was actually experienced as a material increase in wealth for the majority of people. And not through class struggle, largely, not through collective struggle, but through the mixture of the labor shortage, the mining boom, and access to credit. So the mining boom in the first half of this century, in the first part of this century, meant you could like quit your job as a cleaner, become a FIFO worker, so a fly-in, fly-out worker, go drive trucks in mining construction and make 160 grand a year, right? Which caused an upward pressure on wages. And there's very interesting things if you want to get super Marxy and nerdy about it. Like the official economists started talking about the two-speed economy, but I think effectively it meant that there wasn't the tendencies towards averaging the rate of profit for capital accumulation were kind of broken in Australia because the kind of super profits you could make in mining weren't met elsewhere. So that creates weird patterns of deformity. So you have this period of so that's up until about 2013. Where it's played out, I mean, there hasn't been a great deal of fight. There's been specific fights about wages, often have broken out either in the heavily unionized, high-paid sector. So, say, on the wharves, there's always been an attempt to break the wharves, or on the low end, so workers in chicken plants, those kind of things. Where it's broadly felt, though, is around the question of housing. So the housing market in Australia, house prices are so ridiculously high and rents are so high, there's a very particular generational split. So if you own a house, one of your main forms of wealth is the rising value of that house, right? Which also, and that's 2/3 of Australian households live in a house that they own. A third of those own it outright, a third are paying a mortgage. For renters, they're increasingly locked out of that housing market and rents grow at this astronomical rate. And so it has actually been around, like what I'm talking with comrades is for a whole generation of young people, the wage is not the point of antagonism. It is rent, if that makes sense. Rent is the point of antagonism that tries to express this. How do you fight over rent, right? What happens? So I'd say for kind of communists and anarchist comrades, they're doing this hard work of trying to form renters' unions, fighting site-specific battles. But also where I live in Brisbane, a group of comrades more influenced by the Bernie and Corbyn wave have basically taken over the Greens here and pushed them to the left and have had electoral success. Unbelievable electoral success that is even blew the minds of the National Greens here, largely mobilizing the generational experience of rent. Now, this has often been linked to a broader politics about the city and about space that also connects to a politics of a critique about colonialization and the exclusion of Indigenous people. Now, that's happened now. My longer view would have been there was a kind of wave of struggles in the 90s that kind of built up, that went through the defense of social democracy, environmental struggles, cultural struggles, the alter globalization movement, then the anti-war movement. And when that was defeated, that led to a long period of defeat, and a long period of demoralization that actually happened, coincided with the mining boom. So people felt this kind of defeat on the political level and retreated privately. And I think now, after that 20-year lull, as the kind of deal begins to fragment, because wages really haven't developed, haven't moved since 2013, debt is particularly high, there's extreme cost of living pressures, and focused on rent, we're beginning to see a kind of re-articulation of struggle. Also, as well, there are those ongoing Indigenous struggles and the environmental movement, has moved and changed and whatever, and is in different spaces. So I guess broadly that's how it looks. Conservative governments keep on attempting to change industrial relations and keep on failing at different levels. So that would broadly where it'd be. What is the condition of comrades? I think there is far less people in left groups than there were 20 or 30 years ago. and the left groups that exist are much smaller. I think people are far more in informal spaces, small collectives and milieus, though there has been, I'm quite friendly with people I've got, comrades in a group called the Revolutionary Communist Organization, and there are attempts to kind of reform these, but the organized left is probably smaller than it has been in the past. But there's also, in the South Brisbane Greens, more people experimenting with kind of left social democracy. And if people are interested in going, well, what are their politics? They have a website and a podcast called Flood, and you can hear them just articulate that and kind of describe that. And they would have a critical approach to their engagement. Does that make sense, Varn? Trying to get
it's interesting how like the growth of the social, although that's in decline here right now.
Yeah, well, but also as well, like we never really had our movement of squares here.
Right.
Like Occupy happened, but it was a very small Minotaurian phenomena. There wasn't that 2008 crisis that led to explosion, right? We really haven't had that. And in terms of and even in terms of our industrial fights, like the last big industrial fight that had like a national significance was the 1998 MUA wharf dispute, where so the Maritime Union of Australia, so unionization is very low in Australia, very low in the private sector. And the areas where it does exist are often, say, particularly in inner city building sites or on the wharves, you have a small amount of people, heavily unionized, large influence of the Communist Party that's there, and very high wages. And in an export-based economy, the fact that you have a small group of highly unionized workers that dominate the wharves is a major fucking problem for capital. So capital have always wanted to smash the unions on the wharves. And in 1998, under the Howard Liberal government, they tried to do that. As in, they went in with guys in balaclavas in the middle of the night and kicked all the workers off and brought in an entire scab workforce trained in the Gulf with cooperation from the military to replace that workforce. And they were defeated, right? But that was one of those fights where everyone was involved. If you you went to that picket line, and it was incredible. It was an amazing experience. This was happening at the same time that in the Northern Territory in Australia, that there was an attempt to stop to mining in a place called Jabiluka, to stop uranium mining, that was also maintaining this like long blockade and picket, working with the indigenous people in the area. So they were big national fights. When I was at uni in 1998, people were jumping on buses to travel thousands of kilometers to go be on that Jabiluka blockade, and everyone else who wasn't doing that was, heading up to the MUA picket lines. It's been a long time since there's been a fight with that national level. And I think when I talk to comrades, I say, well, what do we need to do? What doesn't happen in Australia is the circulation of struggles. You have lots of struggles in little pockets, but the experience don't circulate through to develop some level of a national fight, if that makes sense. Now, if comrades can do that, if we just need a really good YouTube station, we do that, or if that's determined by the material conditions, I think is another point of conversation.
Well, the whole dialectic here between economic determinism, aka material conditions, and political determinism, aka consciousness raising, is always
yeah. And I'm very heavy. Like I'm very heavy these days on that. Like it is very that conscious activity can only do a small amount of things, and it's unclear what it can do. So like I'm very much like work out. Can you do something that is useful? Why do you think it would be useful? I do not, I'm not like build the party and we'll solve the conditions. You've got to work within the conditions of the time. Like I think that's actually what being a materialist means. If communism is possible, it exists in some version in the material conditions in the present, in the struggles that are going on. Lots of small ones. You need to investigate, theorize, circulate, and participate, right? And work out what's useful. And it does matter to think about because often the other thing you get is that hype demoralization cycle. You know, like it goes, why can't we get things started up? It's because people are fucked. People are fucked. There we go. You know, like nothing is possible. Actually understanding these conditions, I think, is important, and where the point of tension is, and where the investigations that need to be done. Though, like, there's lots of comrades that are experimenting over a time, you know, with doing workers' inquiries and things like that. I'm working with some comrades at the moment doing some investigation into renewable energy, and there's some interesting kind of, you know, obviously that's a huge thing for Australia, as Australia is a company that digs shit out of the ground and sends it overseas, and a lot of our power is still produced by coal-fired power plants. Can capital have a transition to renewable energy that is still good for capital, right? That's a big debate in Australia. So this might blow your mind, but the Business Council of Australia, the ACTU, so that's the Australian Council of Trade Unions, and an environmental group, maybe the WWF, not the wrestling, the Worldwide Wildlife Federation, get together and build strategy documents about how Australian capitalism can do a renewable transition, right? So we're doing some investigation into that, and we're doing some workers' inquiries. But I certainly think, you know, you've got to look at what's going on rather than just hype activists. But sorry, I'm ranting and getting off track again.
No. Well, I was about to say my between these two poles, I tend to be kind of. I am not always a Leninist, but I am on this question, and that is that a revolutionary situation has some subjective and mostly objective
for sure
conditions, and like
it matters what you do, but you don't really know what to do or what it will do.
Right, exactly, and you don't pick your context. I have seen this. I talk about it, you know, as like the true horseshoe theory or whatever. Your economic determinists will, you know, economic determinism can be like inevitabilist or defeatist, and sometimes they're the same people. And then
for sure.
And like these politics first or political determinist people are, you know, blah 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 consciousness, blah 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 consciousness, and then they fail and flip over to the other. So,
and it's also like, what do you find useful? There's probably a lot of things that are useful, right? So like, you know, if I look at, like, I try to do, like, I got a full-time job, I got kids, I got a partner, so I've got limited time. What is useful for me to do? It's not necessary for me to be at every rally. Who cares if I'm there or not? But, you know, like, I'm really involved in my local community group over very boring local community issues. And part of that's because it's like, for there to be politics, people have to meet, right? What is useful in the outer suburbs is creating space. I try to do theoretical work because I think that matters. You know, having an idea, having a good understanding of the conditions you're in may help. Like, I don't think theory is everything. You know, often when you do theoretical work, people are like, you just think reading a book will determine everything. No, I don't think reading a book will determine everything. But I think having trying to have a decent understanding of the conditions that you operate in matter, right? And also, I think if you believe, and I believe, that the future relies in people taking control of their conditions and collectively and consciously transforming them, understanding their conditions is part of that, right? Absolutely. Like, if you don't believe people are willing to seriously think about what's going on in their world, then you don't believe they can transform that world. And, you know, we talked about evangelicals. You know, every week in Australia, there are hundreds of thousands of people who are sitting in homes going page by page through the Bible, right? Talking about it very seriously. People want to hear ideas. People want to understand the world. And I think that's kind of useful. And I think also kind of useful for people of my generation is being a bit of a librarian of knowledge. You know, like, I was very much, you know, I'm still deeply influenced by what 20 years ago we called autonomous Marxism, but now we probably call post-workerism or whatever. But we weren't very good at reproducing our understandings in Australia. Like, a lot of those kind of theoretical debates of the ultra-globalization movement and the ultra-globalization movement itself are not known by young comrades. And so I think what's also useful is trying to talk about these kind of historical experiences. Then I've got very good friends from Wollongong who are involved in a thing called Wollongong Outer Workers, or WOW, which is in the early 80s, that did all this amazing unemployed activism. So that kind of historical work is also really crucial too. So it's just finding out what is useful in those moments. As for, you know, the organizational question, I really think that'll, you know, the material conditions determine the appropriate form of, or, you know, there's a lot of influence in young comrades to go, oh, what the fuck did Kautsky do? like, okay, whatever. But I don't think you can import the organizational models of the past to the present, particularly because one of the things that I hope I've communicated to you is the specificity of class and capital in Australia. That the Australian conditions have to be thought directly, and we can't just import models from the past or America or Europe. They have to be thought in their unique particular conditions here, and that's in the inner city, but particularly when you get out to the hinterland. So I don't know how I got to that rant, but there you go.
Well, no, I mean, it's hard to get Americans to talk about their actual material conditions, and our material conditions are dominant and probably known by the entire planet. Whereas,
totally.
what
is actually happening here? What does it actually look like? What is really going on and also to understand that, and this is the influence of people like Holloway and Bonefeld on me, is that there is struggle there. Like, I'm certainly influenced by the idea that everywhere you go, people are pushing or struggling, often in very small ways, but being able to see that and recognize that language and be open to that is crucial. So I think that's often a challenge here.
I guess that should get me to get into the specifics a little bit. A lot of if the American left has any passing knowledge of the Australian left at all, which is a big if, not just because American parochialism, but of the British, the post-British settler colonies. You guys are literally the furthest away from us. And also, your conditions rhyme, but don't really everything totally seems foreign to an American. So, including even your seasons. So it's something that if we've had encountered it, it's actually been through the IS traditions in Australia. Are your version of salt, which is not our version of salt, which is also confusing, but
well, and look, I was in the ISO in the 90s. So that is that, and it's probably it is. If there is a left group here, it is still prominent. It's Socialist Alternative, and which is a particular inheritor of the Cliffite trajectory in Australia. Gone through very strange mutations. I went to one of their first national conferences in the late 90s. So it originally split on a kind of anti-activist, not anti-activist, like in an anti-hype moment, because when French nuclear testing happened, there was lots of anti-nuclear testing rallies in Australia, and the IS recruited really quickly, which we were recruiting 3 times our membership at a rally. Right. So there was this idea that, oh my God, the revolution's about to break out. And then the people who formed Socialist Alternative were like, no, that's insane. This is just paper members. That's got to go nowhere. And so they started in that trajectory, but then have gone this particular kind of, I would say, heavily sectarian, sell newspapers, wrote hyperactivist direction. And they are the kind of the prominent tradition. In terms of if you're looking for an organized expression, the group that was the biggest when I was a kid, which was the Democratic Socialist Party, which was kind of from a more orthodox Trotskyist position, has shrunk to a rump within a group called Socialist Alliance. And that Socialist Alliance process was very much influenced by what happened in Scotland in the early 2000s, but also was a reaction to the ultra-globalization movement. During the ultra-globalization movement, there was an explosion of interest in ultra-left and anarchist ideas, and the traditional socialists were kind of outflanked to the left. So Socialist Alliance kind of arose out of that.
Yeah, again, there's this mirror world tradition that we talk about here, but the IS tradition basically saved Trotskyism in America until the CWT tradition came and also kind of added to that.
That's the militant tendency, right?
Yeah, that's the militant tendency.
So they have only ever, there's this really strange regionalism in Australia, right? They've only ever prominently existed in Melbourne, and they've gone through a number of splits, but they have a very prominent activist called Stephen Jolly, who is a local councillor there, I think. But so that kind of militant tradition has been very Melbourne based. But that regionalism is not something, so in the late 60s, you had Maoists in Melbourne, Trotskyists in Sydney, and anarchists in Brisbane. Like you get these, because the distances are so huge, you do get these particular kind of, less now, things are more homogenized, but you have these kind of, it's not a national phenomena, it's a very much a city-based phenomena. So yeah, I guess the CP as well.
Yeah, that's I mean, we do have regional dominance, but these sectarian groups basically, the IS was the biggest, so that was never terribly big.
Can you just wait for a moment, Varn?
No problem. No problem. So the IS tradition kind of during the ultra-globalization movement saved Trotskyism in the United States. Our Trotskyist movements pretty much died in the 80s.
Yeah,
those movements have died here in the last 5 years. I mean, our IS tradition dissolved. They all entered the Democratic Socialist of America. They've kind of lost any Trotskyist identity.
That's interesting because I guess during the ultra-globalization movement, probably the people that were the level of the real thinkers in the IS here were kind of won over either to maybe particularly through this is something we haven't talked about actually, and is actually crucial, is the racial hierarchies in Australia have relied on the hyper oppression of refugees that have tried to get here through ways that aren't formally legitimate. So since I think since the late 90s, if you turn up on a boat on Australian shores, you get thrown in a camp, right? And so there is now this network of camps that the Australian state have largely offshore. Now I've forgotten the exact history throughout the South Pacific, and also do turnbacks at sea, where people, get the Australian Navy stops you and turns you back, right? But there were these refugee camps, these endless detention centres that were built throughout Australia, and the movements tried to smash them. People went into the desert, pulled down the fences, and people escaped. And some of those people lived free for 20 years. And a lot of people that were in the IS were kind of won over to, I guess, kind of a Gambins politics, particularly about the camp, and went in various different directions. So the encounter of two things to go back. The small point, the IS tradition encountered the ultra-globalization and the struggle against borders and lost a whole bunch of people. There are still some people stayed within that tradition. There are some people in a group called Solidarity, which is the only legitimate kind of, another part of the IS tradition here. And they do really hard work, that day in, day out grind work around refugee struggles that are still in that. But that is an important thing to think about Australia too, is the kind of politics that you're seeing, say, the Conservatives take up in the UK around undocumented migration is a politics that the Australian state pioneered. And the human cost of that, in terms of people dying at sea, is horrific, right? Or people that have spent decades imprisoned in camps is horrific. And the post-social democratic left just completely shat the bed on this. That their unwillingness to substantially resist this, to go along with this hegemony, the impact on people's lives, outrageous. But the other side of that, the struggle of people in camps and their supporters outside is actually heroic. Some of it probably will never be written about because it involved breaking the law. People busted people out of camps and took them around Australia and gave them lives for decades. That's probably should be told, but it might take a long time before that's been told. That's an important thing we should think about. And the effect of that movement, the struggle over undocumented migration, and against that oppression, was really important and really exhausting for a lot of people as well. Because the human cost of it was so high, and there's still that kind of it's still really fucked. And it was important. I actually can't remember where it's up to at the moment, where our camps are and what was shut down under the new Labor government and what wasn't, but it's been a decade-long struggle. And that was important for the left as well. And also going back as well, what was important too was the development of organizations that were non-white organizations of people who had been in detention. Organizations like Cross Border and Rise, I think they call them. My memory's getting bad. So there was a debate around race and whiteness within the movement itself.
This brings me to a kind of interesting point about the other influence of Australian left figures in the United States. The only prominent Australian who's had not even that much influence, but some significant influence in the U.S. left is kind of a defector from the anti-politics crowd, and that's Tad Teza.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah, no, I've known Tad. Look. I really like Tad. I've known Tad and I were in the IS together when I was a teenager. So I really like Tad. I'd consider him as a friend. I think the I mentioned Liz Humphreys before. So
his
Liz
former
and Tad,
partner, I believe.
Partner, and they pioneered that anti-politics stuff. That anti-politics stuff I think is still very useful. The Greens, the South Brisbane Greens that I mentioned before, are very influenced by that anti-politics argument. So, I think Tad's ideas should be taken seriously. So, he's a good guy.
Yeah.
I disagree with him. I disagree with him a lot. Like, obviously, he took a very different position on COVID and lockdowns and the like than I did at the time. I just kind of went along, with basically when COVID happened, I went, I don't understand how to manage a global pandemic. So I just took an entirely agnostic position. I didn't do that thing saying we should do this or we shouldn't do that. I think there are really important critiques to, like, a large section of the left in Australia became a pro-lockdown left, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does.
I think this also met with a kind of Australian version of Trump derangement syndrome, where the populace are crazy reactionaries. Progress is the state doing things, right? In Queensland, our lockdowns weren't particularly harsh. We mainly they shut off the borders, and while numbers were low, you had a large amount of personal autonomy. But obviously, I'm a white collar worker who could work from home. Like, the kind of class divisions of lockdown and what that meant, and then particularly in Sydney, where that kind of multicultural racial picture I talked about before is really geographically coded in Sydney, where the western suburbs are seen as the poorer working class and migrant suburbs in Sydney. Like, the level of policing that lockdown meant there was horrific, right? So, like, now I think more of us who kind of abstained or kind of went along are probably saying, like, okay, Tad's arguments, like the critique of lockdown, I'm willing to consider it more. And I also think we should use this time to think more about what a class response to crisis and pandemics are. We're about to have a really fucked bushfire season, right? Like, climate apocalypse is playing out in Australia through a cycle of floods and bushfires. Trying to work out what a response to this is, I think, is really kind of crucial. And also, on the other hand, also reflecting on what we also see in the response to these crises are often a kind of, to use the term that comrades like Nick Southall from Wollongong use, like disaster communism. We also see a disaster communism emerge from these disasters that we should try to maintain. So, yeah. Anyway, you're saying Tad's got some influence. I think, yeah, his work is worth reading.
Yeah, I think he's. I am, I guess, similar to you. I'm ambivalent about his work to some degree. I think some things he said has actually been kind of shown out about the power of the biosecurity state, but he also has Not quite as gone as far as like a Gombin, but there's
Yeah.
also
Okay.
certain,
So
like,
yeah.
you know,
So John and I on our podcast did an interview with Tad a couple of years ago on anti-politics,
mhm.
and I guess the problem that I probably have with the take on anti-politics is probably the same critique that made me kind of leave really capital U, capital L ultra leftism. You know,
Mhm.
where you often kind of get this idea that most of what we consider activity is just bullshit and recuperated and empty. However, there is going to be this genuine moment of real activity, right? So the standard ultra left kind of way it was played out in Australia, particularly when I was in a group called the Treason Collective, was everything is over there is recuperation. We want real communist activity, right?
Mhm.
And then at some point I realized that's not how people live their lives, right? People are enmeshed not only in the material conditions, but the political and ideological conditions. And they're struggling and they're trying to work them out. And people's ideas are contradictory. Like I kind of think that most people that I kind of talk to are a mixture of like social democrats and the Unabomber, if that makes sense. You know, like in
Yeah,
the terms
yeah,
of
definitely. I
like
definitely see that.
they want to be like, okay, can we win this reform? I also think we should destroy civilization. You know, like it's like, and in that kind of world, you got to kind of work out how you relate to people. I would say the same with kind of like the anti-politics critique. It's like I do agree. There's this whole bunch, you know, that I do agree with the level that politics has no kind of formal, like the link between the political class and social struggles that go on is broken. But I do still think you can work out attempts of useful activity that often involves some kind of engagement with people that are still in those political spaces and see what happens. Obviously, what you want to do in a genuine way is develop an articulation of something that goes beyond it. You know, like I can't, like, you know, I remember turning up, we used to turn up when I was an ultra leftist, turn up at these like social democratic rallies with these very dense leaflets about why this is shit and recuperation, and like obviously found no audience. Like
Right.
I feel kind of the same. It's like I think you can take those kind of critiques of recuperation or of anti-politics, but it still leaves a wider space for trying to work out what you should struggle about. I should probably go do some child rearing in a moment too as well,
Yeah,
even though
no
I'm finding
problem.
this fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah.
I hope you found this kind of useful. I feel we could talk about forever and dig into a
Oh,
number of
absolutely. And
multiple different
maybe,
points.
I'll probably in about 6 months or so be reaching back out if particularly if there's anything specific coming out of Australia. I've been trying to.
Well, the thing that, sorry to just interrupt. The thing that we haven't talked about is that there is a referendum coming up in a couple of weeks about a constitutional amendment for an indigenous voice to Parliament.
Yeah, let's
And
talk. Let's end on that. So what's going on there?
all right, that's a big question. Okay,
Okay.
it's a really big question. So there has been a particular wing. This is my narrative of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think there has been a particular wing of the indigenous movement that has basically had a look at Australian society and gone, we don't feel that there's like, what is the best that we can get out of a society that seems relatively stable, and we are a numerical minority with limited social power, but suffer these extreme forms of oppression. So key thinkers from that tradition would be people like Noel Pearson, who's a particularly conservative thinker. Marcia Langton would be another one. And people should check out Noel Pearson's Boyer lectures, where you'll get a really in-depth presentation, right? So they're that kind of tradition. And they have been looking at what has been possible. And one particular instantiation of this was the Uluru Statement from the Heart, where a number of Indigenous people and organisations and groups got together and put towards a statement with three principles. So they are treaty, truth telling, and I'm going to get the terms wrong, but effectively a voice in Parliament, right? And not all Indigenous people have sided with this. There is a different radical intellectual Indigenous tradition represented by people like Irene Watson or Eileen Morton Robinson, which Ian Morton Robinson's book, The White Possessive. People should go out and read that. That basically,
Oh, that's a great book.
Yeah,
just seconded. I just read it like this year. It's a great book.
Well, yeah, I'm very critical of it. Like, if you listen to my podcast, one of our last episodes is we engage with it, right? Like, and they also think not a lot can come out of settler colonialism, but take a very different perspective. And they would be very, Chelsea Watago would be another thinker along these lines. But anyway, so the people that were part of this voice, and if people are interested I'm cribbing off notes by Megan Davis, her quarterly essay, right? And so what came out of this was a statement from the heart calling for these three forms of transformation.
Mm-hmm.
That has been taken up by the Australian Labor Party, and I would say large progressive capital, right? But it's also been largely emptied of its content at the same time as it's been taken up. So you have these two dynamics, kind of the indigenous struggle, the Labor Party and capital have taken up this referendum, and an element of the left are moving towards it. So we will go to the polls October 14 to vote whether that should be a voice to Parliament, and the details enshrined in the Constitution. And one reason they wanted it enshrined in the Constitution is there have been various different indigenous bodies in the past, like ATSIC, that carried out representation, had budgets, all these kind of things, and then conservative governments would elect it and abolish them. So there's an idea that if it's in the Constitution, right, then that can't be changed. Now, there's two levels of critique. There's the kind of radical indigenous critique, which has two elements to it, that says treaty first, that this is a mistake. We need treaty first. Or there is a more radical position that says no further engagement or in being interpolated by the state. There is also a reactionary bloc. So I think that the Labor government expected the Liberals, so that's the Liberal National Coalition, would also go along with the referendum. And it's very hard in Australian history for referendums to get up without bipartisan support. But the Liberal Nationals, who the right, have taken a no position, right? Largely, I think, influenced by kind of Trumpian culture war strategy. And this has galvanized a racist bloc. So the no vote, so you kind of have, so that's the kind of terrain. I am going to vote yes, and I'm trying to get a little bit more involved in the yes campaign. I feel that there are two radical positions. There is yes plus or abstention, if that makes sense. Because I think that what will probably happen is, and it looks like at the moment the no vote will win. And I feel that, like, despite the very interesting validity of the indigenous radical critique, it will be read as a demoralizing event and embolden reaction. Like, I don't think what is going to happen is that the voice will be voted down and then treaty will be on the agenda next year. I think what will happen, it'll be voted down and be like, that's fucking it. The same way that when the Republican referendum lost in the late 90s. And that was wild. Like, if you picked up in Australia in the early 90s, if you picked up the Saturday paper, every morning it was like, we're going to become a republic. And, it would be full of what the flag is going to be redesigned as, right? And that was that Hawke Keating progressive neoliberal republicanism. When the Republican referendum was defeated, that has just completely disappeared, right? Like, even though lots of people in the Labor Party would still consider themselves Republicans, like the national discourse just completely, when you talk to people about what the early 90s are compared to now, it blows people's minds. I feel the no victory will probably be a defeat. So the onus will really be on what, those people who are arguing for a radical no position to go, okay, what happens now? I still hope that we can have a yes victory, and that even though I think the voice in its current form will be incredibly limited, I hope it'll do maybe three things. One, open up a new front for struggle. Secondly, bring comrades together. And this is where my thinking has changed over the last 10 years, largely influenced by the social democratic experience, is that even though I don't think the state can deliver, I think the experience of winning, I don't think defeat radicalizes anymore. I think the experience of winning can radicalize. I don't think it has to. I think things are very open and fragmented and whatever. But that is what's going on. But like what we're really seeing is like the No campaign has just allowed this sewer of reaction to kind of spew out. And like what, where we started this conversation by talking about how there'd been this cultural hegemony of the acknowledgement of country. We're partly only seeing that being questioned right now because the No campaign feels so emboldened to push back against all of this, right? So now indigenous activists, thinkers, and comrades are all over this spectrum. There are indigenous people in the reactionary No campaign, a small amount of particular influential indigenous conservative politician. There are indigenous people in the progressive No. There are indigenous people in the progressive Yes. For the white left, this, of course, is very confusing because our traditional practice has been to go, well, we're white people, or maybe not white, but not indigenous, and we will follow where indigenous comrades are going. But what this is showing is that there is a plurality of indigenous politics. So it's a very interesting kind of moment. For me, it's been quite depressing to see what I thought it was just going to be the yes vote that was going to happen. But the way the reactionaries have emboldened this, even though I think the yes vote will be very small. Now, the next thing to dig into, which is probably the hardest thing to think about, and joining two other points of conversation together, is during COVID lockdown, we had our anti-lockdown movement here, what we'd call the cosmic right. An element of what I would say is the indigenous movement has kind of been won over, a small amount has been won over to kind of a cosmic right position. So you have these and it's often over this language of sovereignty. So the sovereign citizen language and some indigenous sovereign, and that is something that is not talked about a lot and is even hard to look at, right? And one of the things that makes it even more complicated, it would be often the non-university educated sections of indigenous activists, so more working class and plebeian, are building these alliances. And it is and the same way that we lost the hippies who are now tied up to the cosmic right, which I actually think is a bad thing. The left used to pull hippies along with them, but they're now increasingly won by the cosmic right. There's been these kind of so there'll be a No protest, I think, this weekend in Brisbane, a No rally that has some key indigenous voices who have this kind of fusion of indigenous politics and cosmic right politics. That's a really interesting and confusing situation, right, that people are operating in. And I guess unlike 20 or 30 years ago, and this goes to Tad and Liz's anti-politics thesis, this is not played out by debates amongst organizations. This is played out as debates by individuals on social media. So what really is the social power that they represent? So that's where we're at. October 14 is the referendum. I will, with a little bit of talking about things that are useful. Hopefully we'll finish some writing on this. I'm very gingerly trying to get written beforehand, explaining my position, feeling, trying to get it right. But I feel behind this is an evolution in my idea about actually how social transformations happen. And also very interested in my local group. So in the suburb I live in, there's a Yes group, and just trying to meet up with them to be like, who are these heads? They're probably all Labor Party trade union people, but I should at least know them, right? Like, who are these heads? Where are they at? And when No wins, where do we go from there?
That is a great point on what we should be following here in States. How can people find your work, Dave?
Yeah, okay. So I have two blogs. One is called The Word from Struggle Street, and the other is called With Sober Senses. And I've also got a podcast, which is on that blog, called Living the Dream. We put out shows. Sometimes we put out heaps, sometimes we put out like one a year. The last one that's up is actually on the white possessive. We did a series on race in Australia, and we looked at 3 books. So we looked at The New Britannia by Humphrey McQueen, Gaston Hage's what is Gaston Hage's book called? That's really bad. Sorry, I have a brain
that
fart
one off the
there.
top of my head.
And Eileen Morton Robinson's The White Possessive, which are three kind of evolutions of thinking of race here. I've got an interview I recorded at the end of last year with a Burmese comrade who lives in Brisbane. That will be very interesting because he's really critical of what we understand as identity politics as well. And John and I are talking about recording again soon. And we also want to get Liz Humphreys back on the show to talk about labourism and what it's like to have a Labor government. So that's where we're there. And you'll find lots of points off to other things in Australia. My references are probably kind of dated, but I think if people can pick up A New Britannia, or that's a really good book to read, or The White Possessive, that also, even though I disagree with it a lot, is a really important Indigenous work that people should read. And from a novel, read Power Without Glory by Frank Hardy. That's also super crucial. I would also recommend a podcast of friends of mine called Crimes of Class. And these are friends of mine from Wollongong, where they talk through their experiences as communists over decades, also in criminalized and working class lives. And that's really worth checking out. But there's lots of amazing stuff. There's a lot of things that should go. And I'm on Twitter. It's still because I'm old. At With Sober Senses, and people just hit me up. I'm happy to talk.
All right. Well,
thanks, Varn. I hope you found that useful.
I did. Let's end on the music.
All right.